So you have a difficult tenant, tenant from hell. Tenant doesn't want to leave, tenant not paying rent. Join us tonight as we talk about how to deal with difficult tenants. We are joined today with Shan Ferdinand,
Hey, y'all.
S&K Property Management. That is what she's sticking with today. And I am Kerry Ferdinand, owner, operator of Black Line Realty. This is Black Line After Hours. Let's go.
Let's go.
Yeah, of course, Black Line Realty is the best. Hampton Road's finest.
Cause I'm with you. Yeah,
What else did you
flood.
think I was going to say?
But shoot, it's still money.
Listen.
It's still a house.
We're just here to dominate.
And it's still investors out here hungry for stuff like this, regardless if it flood or
Hey,
not.
man, I'm telling you, when it comes to this real estate,
We're going to the next one.
anybody can win. You got to know when to take your chance.
Absolutely.
It's Black Line After Hours. Let's go. All right, welcome back. This is Kerry Ferdinand, Black Line owner operator, and I am joined again here with Shan Ferdinand,
Hey.
MBA, S&K owner, and CFO for Black Line Realty. So today we're talking about how to deal with difficult tenants. So if you have more than 2 or 3 properties, or if you've been renting for a while, you know the problems. You have tenants not paying, you have tenants not leaving, you have squatters, and you have everything else in between. So today we are giving tips and tricks on how to deal with difficult tenants. So first things first, I want you to know that this property management thing is not easy. That is why Shan Ferdinand runs that side. So let's go ahead and get started. Shan, what is the first thing in dealing or avoiding difficult tenants?
The first thing you want to do is hire a property manager. And so you, the landlord, don't have to deal with the difficult tenants. And a good property manager is going to be well versed in the tenant/landlord laws in your specific area. Not only that, they facilitate the receipt of rent, the disbursement of funds to owners. They deal with maintenance. They deal with finding and screening tenants, and they deal with the move in and move out inspections, so you don't have to.
So when we're talking about screening tenants, what are some questions that you would ask when you're screening a tenant?
So some landlords, some property managers like to ask pre-qualifying questions before they even send the application to a potential tenant. Those questions might be, does the tenant smoke? Do their family members smoke? Do they have a waterbed, aquarium, or any other water-filled furniture? Because we know that water
Sooner or later, it's going to leak.
exactly, and that causes problems. Have they had 2 or more late payments in the last 6 months to a year? Or have you given proper notice to your most current landlord?
That, and I think one of the other things that a property manager does well is they are the buffer between the landlord and the tenant, because I know in my case, I know we talked about it in the past, where you just, as a landlord, you may actually feel bad with any story that may be given. So you're hiring the bad guy. You're hiring somebody to do the dirty work for you, if you will, or saving you from yourself from making a bad financial decision. Again, I know I said it in the past. I know that I fell for the story a couple of times, which cost me thousands of dollars in the long run. So I, even as owning a real estate company, I personally do not manage my own properties.
Right, because your property manager is hired to do a job. So they're able to take emotions out of the situation and do the job they're paid to do.
Okay. So we hired our property manager. How do we avoid bad tenants?
We avoid bad tenants by the property manager will do a number of things, such as a background check.
So when we talk about a background check, are we talking run credit and do that sort of things?
We run credit, and we don't base a decision on a credit score per se, but payment history. We can look at the tenant's credit history on their credit report, or their payment history on the credit report. We can do a criminal background check. We can also do employment verification. We'll call employers up, the employers that are listed up, and we'll ask, hey, is Jane Doe employed here? how long have they been employed? Because we want to make sure they have stable income to pay rent. We do a rental history verification. We can call up prior landlords and ask about past experience with this particular tenant. And as I mentioned earlier, we ask those pre-qualifying questions before we even get to the background check or the credit check.
Okay, so the reason why I asked that question is because I just want the listeners and the viewers to know that property managers typically have the software and the know-how to run these checks, whereas your typical landlord they don't have a system to screen tenants, and they don't have the software or necessarily the know-how on how to professionally screen these tenants.
Exactly.
So that's the question I was asking.
Absolutely.
So we have our tenant. We found Joe Good tenant, right? And now we want to move Joe Good tenant in. Talk to me about the lease.
So your property manager is going to have hopefully they'll have an ironclad lease that it will avoid any loopholes that a tenant may try to jump through to maybe avoid paying rent or maybe stand in the property. If you have a good property manager, that lease will have gone through a screening process. They'll likely have had an attorney put their eyes on that lease just to make sure that is a strong lease and that it protects the rights of the landlord.
So not only the rights of the landlord, we're also talking about the rights as the tenant, and that goes back to the Landlord Tenant Act.
Absolutely.
So your typical landlord, 1 or 2 properties, they're not keeping abreast with the local laws, regulations, and different changes federally, state, and locally.
Exactly.
So a good property manager is going to make sure that they are abreast of all this to save you, the landlord, any type of pitfalls of not staying abreast of the laws of the land.
Yeah, sometimes those laws are changed every year. And a lot of people don't know that laws are updated and they come out, I think it's July 1 of every year. There are new laws. They may not necessarily be landlord tenant laws, but you want someone who will stay on top and knows when laws are, changed and updated.
And correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of times some people don't know they're doing things wrong. Your landlords don't know that they are violating. A lot of them may say, I just want to deal with military only. I only want a female only. I don't want a single parent. I want, this type of person, that type of person, but they don't realize that they could be violating some kind of Fair Housing Act, even though it might not be anything dealing with race.
Right, absolutely. So there are certain criteria in place. If you have multiple properties or multi-family properties, there are fair housing, Virginia and federal fair housing laws that you have to, follow, and you can't discriminate a potential tenant based upon the factors that you just mentioned, familial status, military status, elderliness, income. Those are the types of things that, you can't make a decision based upon when you're considering a potential tenant and placing them in a property.
Now, I know a lot of times we talk about these leases being ironclad, but I would also say that with every lease, there has to be some kind of language in there where we talk about terms and we talk about expectations and a certain level of expectation management. How do you put that in the lease, and what do you do for the tenants that are violating, and how do you navigate those waters between tenant, because you literally have 2 clients. You have the tenant and you have the landlord. How do you
Correct.
navigate those waters with the lease and communication and that sort of thing?
So there's a conversation that I have with the landlord initially, and we have a conversation about what their expectations are, and if those expectations, obviously, if they're within the law, and we put those in our property management agreement, and then they translate over into that particular landlord's lease. And then once we have that lease in place and we have a potential tenant who applies and their application looks good, then we communicate the landlord's expectations. We communicate those to the tenant, and we let them know that, hey, the landlord's expectations are in writing and they're in this lease. And once we verbally communicate that to the tenant, then we also let them know, hey, it's here, and they have to sign the lease, obviously, agreeing to the terms of the lease and the landlord's expectations.
Now I'm gonna tell you, back in the day when I was a youngster, I ain't read none of that paperwork.
Well, you signed it.
I signed it, but I signed it. I moved my stuff in, and I couldn't tell you what happened to the lease. So the question there is, how, as a property manager, do you follow up and ensure that the landlord's expectations are being met? Because I know 20-year-old Kerry, he just signed the lease and he was in there. Thank God for everybody. I wasn't a big of a partier, that sort of thing. But how do you manage those expectations once the tenant's in the property?
So it just all depends on the tenant, the landlord's expectations. But in some situations, we might have an inspection that we do twice a year, where we go in and we make sure the property is in the condition that the landlord expects it to remain in, and that the tenant is taking good care of the landlord's property. And if not, then there are certain things that we have already put in the lease to remedy situations where the tenant is not taking care of that property.
Now, one of the big things that I know for me can be concerning is I have an expectation of one, maybe two people being in my property, or X amount of people that's on the lease. Then all of a sudden, I start driving by my property, because most landlords do. At some point, a landlord's going to drive by his or her property to view the performance. What happens if a landlord just comes back, or there's a complaint about more people being in the property that should be? How do you handle those sort of situations?
Well, first we have to refer to the lease. If there's language in the lease that says that only two people are allowed, and those two people are named specifically in the lease, then we're good. But if that language says that these two people are only allowed to stay on the property, and those additional people are there, then we have a conversation with the tenant. We have to give them a warning. We have to let them know that, hey, this is what the lease said, and you're in violation of the lease. Now we give them time to correct that violation, and if that violation continues, there are additional actions that we can take to either get those people out who are not on the lease. We can get them out because technically they're trespassing, or we take action against the tenant.
So it sounds to me like a property manager is there to safeguard the landlord from any kind of legal issues.
Correct.
Conversely, are there situations where the landlord could be difficult? Because I know we're talking about how to deal with difficult tenants, but what about the landlord's expectations once the tenants move in being unreasonable to the point to where it's making our tenants that tenant situation hostile, if you will?
Right. So tenants have rights too. They have the right to live in a safe environment. And so we have to have, at that point, me as a property manager, I have to sit down with the landlord and point out to them, in my case, Virginia Landlord and Tenant Acts, hey, you're creating a hostile environment for this tenant, and it says here that this tenant has a right to live in a safe environment. And this tenant has a right to take legal action against you because you're not providing them what they're paying for, essentially.
Okay, so one of the issues dealing with a difficult tenant, what comes uppermost on most people's mind is, I'm not getting paid. I'm missing my my rents. I'm not getting paid on time, or they're shorting me my funds. What are some ways that you safeguarded against that, and what are some ways to mitigate those problems?
So the first thing we recommend is that you put some type of late fee in place. If the tenant, usually there's a 5-day grace period. Rent is due on the 1st, and they have until the 5th to make the full repayment. Anything after the 5th is considered late, and you can assess a late payment fee. And hopefully, most people don't want to pay late fees. So once the tenant is charged a late fee, the first or second time, they get on track. Another thing we do is have the landlord communicate with us, and we can communicate with the tenant about what's going on in their financial situation, because sometimes people do fall on hard times. And if you have a good tenant that may be falling on hard times, we don't want to put them out on the street. We want to work with them. So we recommend to the landlord that they set up some type of payment arrangement, or they allow us to set up some type of payment arrangement with the tenant. And if that doesn't work, there are legal actions that the landlord can take if they're not receiving rent.
And in this situation, we're talking more over the property manager is going to be the one to start your eviction proceedings.
Correct.
Okay. So some other things I know, what about destruction of property? Because I know beforehand we were talking about insurances and different sort of things to safeguard the property against the tenants themselves. Can you touch on that for us?
So that is one, that's the purpose of the security deposit. That's one of the purposes of the security deposit. If the tenant has damaged property, hopefully you've assessed that that security deposit and it's enough to cover any damages. If it's excessive damages, there are insurance policies specifically for landlords that may cover a damage of property. There's your homeowner's insurance. Like I said, there's a specific type of insurance policy that is geared towards landlords that you want to have in place. You also want to make sure that your tenants have renter's insurance in place.
So one thing I learned about renter's insurance is either the property management or the landlord or both can be a rider on the insurance. So that way we can make sure that not only do they have insurance, we make sure that it hasn't lapsed. That's why I said make sure we have insurance. But also, if there's something wrong with the property, we can communicate, or the property manager or the landlord can communicate and figure out what's going on with the insurance company instead of being left in the dark.
Absolutely.
Okay. As far as animals, pets, those sort of things, do you recommend, or is it? I mean, it's okay to say that it's
The animals aren't
situational. You can say it's situational, but are there situations where you say, "Hey, I recommend not to lease to a certain type of breed"?
I would say it's situational, and it just all depends on the landlord's preference. Sometimes landlords prefer to put breed restrictions in place. Other times, not so much. But I don't typically make a recommendation with regard to that. I explain to the landlord what the potential results or what potential outcomes could be, and if they're prepared to take those risks, and then I let them make the decision for themselves as to whether or not they want to allow certain breeds and animals.
So you're also there as somebody to confide in, where you could say you give advice.
Yes.
You give advice based upon the word I'm looking for is risk management. You help the owner with risk management.
Absolutely.
Okay. So,
and I just want to add that with respect to animals, there are situations where a landlord has to allow animals, and that's when people have certified service animals. A landlord can not allow people with service animals to rent their property.
Now, we were talking before about not receiving payment. So what about the ones that just abandon the property?
Oh, so we've actually had that happen with one of our landlords. The landlord rehabbed the property, and the tenant agreed to terms after the property was rehabbed and signed a lease and agreed to a crazy situation. But landlord, after after the rehab was completed, the tenant didn't pay, and so the landlord went out and noticed that the property looked abandoned. And at that point, a notice of suspected abandonment has to go out to the tenants. And then with the notice pretty much says that, hey, we think this property has been abandoned. You have X amount of time to respond to the landlord. If you don't respond, the landlord considers this property abandoned, and that the landlord will take back possession of the property, and the tenant no longer has rights to that property.
So to be clear, as a landlord, I just can't kick open the door and reclaim my property. Is that what you're saying?
No, you cannot kick the door with the full force. No, you can't.
I was very specific. I'm gonna look into the camera. I was very specific because there's a small group of people that believe that because it's my property, I could go ahead and reclaim my property at any time.
No, just as tenants have to abide by the Virginia or the Landlord and Tenant Acts for that specific area, landlords have to do the same. And there are time requirements, time frames, timelines that you have to follow, and documents that have to be given or served to a tenant in order for you to take certain actions. So you have to follow the law. Otherwise, when you go to court, if you don't follow the law, you risk the court ruling in favor of the tenant as opposed to you, the landlord.
Okay. So lastly, we talked about non-payment. I believe we may have even talked a little squatter situation. Did we talk about squatters?
Offline we did.
Okay, so what's your advice to somebody who had a vacant property, they're out of state, and they suspect that they have squatters? What is the expectation that they should have for their property manager?
The expectation they should have for the property manager is for the property manager to be in communication with an attorney, because sometimes, depending on what state you're in, those squatter situations can become very complicated. Because in some states, once a squatter has lived in a property for X amount of time, they do have rights to that property. And so you want to get a property manager who has a great a knowledgeable real estate attorney on their team to handle situations like that.
And to be clear, your if you have property management in place, that property should have never had squatters in it, because your property manager should have done their job by going and inspect the property every so often to ensure and making sure that they are communicating with law enforcement if there is suspected squatters.
That is absolutely correct.
All right, so to finish this out, is there anything that you feel like we left off? Any valuable information that you could leave a landlord, or even on the flip side, a tenant that's dealing with a difficult landlord? Because I like to flip the coin. Is there anything that you would like to touch on before we close this out, as far as how to deal with a difficult tenant? And then if you want to flip it, if they're difficult landlord.
Yeah, absolutely. So we touched on it earlier, but I want to just reemphasize the importance of knowing your rights as both a tenant and a landlord, because, on each side of the spectrum, you do have rights. And familiarize yourself. I know in Virginia, you can just Google Virginia Landlord and Tenant Act. There's a whole lot of laws put in place to protect both tenants and both landlords. And just know your rights.
Anything as far as for landlords?
Yeah, hire S&K Property Management.
Facts. Big facts. I'm trying to think. I believe that's it. I think that's a wrap. And for any questions about property management, who should they contact and where?
They should contact me, Shan Ferdinand. Telephone number 757-872-2358. Website is VA Prop Management MGMT. So VAPROP MGMT.com. Or you can email me at shan@blacklionret.com. And
the information will be below. And one other thing to talk about is that 10 to 9 is definitely, you can definitely go through S&K Property Management to get to 10 to 9 about renting out some space. If you're in the Hampton Roads area and you're looking for office space and you're looking to use some of this beautiful podcast equipment that we have, definitely contact Shan Ferdinand and her people over there at S&K Property Management to get more information. My name is Kerry Ferdinand. This is Black Line After Hours. Thank you for joining us.
Signing off.
Normally we give the information, but I'm gonna go ahead and drop it in the link below. So, hey, 2 up, 2 down. Shout out to Virginia and Hampton Roads area, and see you next week. This is Black Line After Hours.